What's up, everybody? I hope you had a good weekend. I did. Went to the Goodwood members meeting on Saturday, which was awesome. Went in a very special car as well, and you can see a video on that hopefully tomorrow. But I hope you lot had a great one. We're in the build-up now to F1's 1000th Grand Prix, which is pretty special, I have to say. And I think they're going big on it. There are going to be a lot of celebrations around it, a lot of unique features and things happening this weekend that don't normally happen. So really looking forward to the Chinese Grand Prix. Preview, of course, coming later in the week with another giveaway. So look out for that one. Today, though, is Monday. I'm in Manchester. I'm coming to a teaching hospital up here, NHS teaching hospital, to give a talk around Formula One and around building a strong, high-performing team within their organisation, using F1 as a model for that. So that should be interesting. But because it's Monday and because there's been loads of questions as ever from you lot, it's Ask Elvis. So what's up then? I have done my talk, went very well. It's talking to a group of hospital staff and management leadership teams about how Formula One teams become successful. It's not about, even in Formula One, it's not just about budget. There are plenty of examples where teams have had massive budget and yet not been successful. You could look at Ferrari, have had probably the biggest budget of all Formula One teams, yet haven't won the championship for a long, long time. You can look at the likes of McLaren over the last few years as a great example of that. You can look at the likes of Force India in recent times, who've had a very small comparative budget and yet overachieved. So as much about how you spend your budget, about how you operate, how you work as a team, as it is about out-and-out finance. So that's what I've been talking about today, and it was really interesting. But I've got loads of questions from you lot to get through, so let's crack on. Start with this one from Manny Mackay, who says, hi Mark, I hear the commentators talk about a driver's bad start almost every race. Could you explain what the procedure for the driver is and if there are any driver aids involved, and also what is the engineer's input? Well, it's a good question, because we've seen Lewis Hamilton, haven't we, have a couple of bad starts so far this season. Even he's talked about how he's not managed to perfect it. And you know, the rules have been changed in recent years for exactly that reason, to try and encourage a little bit of unpredictability and to encourage driver skill to make the difference, rather than just engineering software and that kind of thing. So what happened in recent years was the process has been put back in the hands of the driver. Previously there were two clutch pedals. The driver at the start was able to dump, just literally let go and dump one clutch pedal. That would then, within the software, open the clutch to a preset point that the engineers had programmed in off the back of all the practice starts, that would be essentially at the bite point. You could then program in the software a kind of plateau in terms of position of the clutch to allow the engine revs to build up at that bite point, giving exactly the right amount of bite on the clutch itself. And then the driver would control the second phase of the clutch on the other paddle to release, depending on how much wheel spin you would get, how much traction. You could then release in the second part of that clutch operation. That's now changed. And nowadays the drivers have just one paddle in which they have total control, and the clutch operation has to be absolutely linear in comparison to the paddle. So if you open the paddle that much, the clutch has to move in a linear fashion. So if you open the clutch paddle 1%, the clutch itself has to move 1%, and so on and so on. So that means that the driver has to control things like wheel spin and bite point, just like you do in your road car. But of course, on a Formula One start procedure, those variables in terms of grip levels are massively changing. If you get a bit of wheel spin, the driver has to back off with the clutch or back off with the throttle. Yes, he can have some aids on the dashboard in terms of things like engine revs, engine speed. He can have lights for that as well. But nothing in terms of the clutch operation can be controlled now by the engineers or the software. So that's why we're getting kind of variation in start quality and drivers having bad starts. But that's exactly the purpose of these new rules. So hopefully, Manny, that gives some explanation to that. Phil Mitchell says, Leclerc was asked to press the oil button. Just wondering if you had any idea what that could mean. So that was back in Bahrain, I presume you're talking about, Phil, and I can't remember the specific incident, I didn't hear it, but what that tends to be normally is that the driver or the engine, the power unit, has a main oil tank, and then there's also an auxiliary oil tank. So as you go through a race or through a session and the engine invariably uses some oil, which it does, and of course we have pretty strict limits on that now, but it still uses oil, there's an auxiliary tank which the driver has to manually transfer oil over. So by pressing the oil button, or if he's instructed to press the oil button, more often than not, that will be to transfer using a tiny pump some oil from the auxiliary tank back in to replenish the main tank, so that there's always the right level in there. So I imagine that's what it was. Colin Banfield says, given that Red Bull has very little patience with underperforming drivers, do you believe it possible that by the middle of the season Gasly will have been replaced by Albon, like Kvyat was replaced by Verstappen? Well, Red Bull can be impatient at times, but I think it's way too early, but at this point in the season, after just 2 races, to start thinking along those lines. I don't think Red Bull would be thinking along those lines just yet at all. First of all, somebody like Albon hasn't had a chance to prove himself, and secondly, Gasly certainly hasn't had enough time to prove to the team that he's not justified to be in that car either. So I think there's a long way to go before we ever get to the point of Red Bull starting to chop and change their driver lineup. But later down the line, further down the season, we know how cutthroat that program can be. So there's no reason why that couldn't happen, but I think just too early to say just yet. Suyash Iren says, how are signals from the steering wheel transmitted as we see no connectors or wires? Okay, so Suyash, I guess what you mean is you take the steering wheel off, you hold it in one hand, you connect it to the column. How do all the electronics make that connection? Because there's no physical wire hanging off the back of the steering wheel that you have to plug in. What happens is that inside that quick release connector on the back of the steering wheel, quite often it's gold or black anodized. In the middle of there is a kind of military grade pin connector with multiple pins and multiple connections. They are guided onto the opposing part of that connector, which is in the end of the steering column, and through absolutely meticulously, accurately machined splines on the column itself, mean that once they are connected, once the splines are connected between the wheel and the column, it means it's perfectly lined up with these tiny pin connectors, and they interlock with each other as the wheel is secured onto the column. So essentially you can't get it wrong as long as the wheel is fully attached to the column. And the cable then from that connector on the column runs all the way down the centre of the steering column and off to the various boxes and control units that it needs to be attached to. So that's how the connections are made between all the buttons on the wheel and the systems on the rest of the car, through tiny pin connectors and then a wire running right down the centre of the steering column. Niak says, why isn't DRS allowed at all times on the entire track in F1, regardless of distance to the car ahead? Wouldn't that make it more challenging for the drivers and more entertaining to watch? Well, Niak, the point of DRS is to try and give an advantage, a temporary advantage, to a car that's close behind, to allow them to close up because of the problems we have with modern F1 cars and following closely. That's why DRS was introduced. So if you allow all drivers to have it all the time, it actually just negates the whole purpose of DRS. And actually, yes, it might make the cars all faster around the lap, but it wouldn't help with its original intended purpose, which is to allow them to close up and assist in terms of an overtake. So I guess until we do away with the fact that we don't need DRS anymore, which I'm sure we'd all love, we actually kind of need to keep it because it serves a purpose. And another one from Niak. Lucky you got 2 in this week. But you say, what is your opinion on drivers using coaches or psychologists? Verstappen has said he doesn't see the need or the point of it, and I believe that Hülkenberg does use one. Were they already used during your time at McLaren? It's really interesting, actually. There seems to be a split in the field where around half the drivers tend to use them or have used them. Others just think it's nonsense and that they don't need them, and their driving skill will get them through. It's a very kind of young attitude to have that, and I think Verstappen having that, he's got this arrogance about him, Verstappen. Verstappen is a wonderful, wonderful driver. I think he's an absolute brilliant breath of fresh air for Formula One, but he's still young. And that arrogance will get him so far. It may get him all the way. But when he comes up against problems, which he could well do, and, depending what his mental strength is like, if he has performance problems over the course of his career, where he starts to disappear off the radar and falls backwards or has recurring issues, the psychological impact of that can be massive, and he may not know how that will affect him at this point if he's never come up against it. And that's where the psychological coaches can really help, and lots of drivers do find it really useful and helpful for them. I think Romain Grosjean put it very succinctly when he said, we train every other muscle in our body, we train physically day in, day out, but yet we don't do anything specifically to train our minds, our brains, and our psychology. He said it's just as important, if not more important, in terms of our performance and performance factor. So it makes perfect sense to start coaching that and training that and seeing your brain and your psychology as a tool to be better. So that's why he and others have used it. And yes, to answer your question, it was used in my time. David Coulthard was the first driver that I knew that started utilising a kind of mind coach, if you like, someone to help him in that side of things, and he found it useful. Others, like Kimi, didn't see the point of it at all. So there's conflicting opinions on it. Essentially, it comes down to a driver's personality and the people around him as to whether they can be convinced to utilise something like that. Right, well that was a bit awkward. Somebody came into the room, so I thought I'd better stop. I'm not used to doing this sort of stuff in public. Right, let's carry on then, because Richard Hook asks this one. He says, with Ocon out in the wilds of other motorsports, Bottas impressive, but can it be sustained? Is George Russell looking like a 2020 Mercedes seat thanks to testing display, or is that just smoke and mirrors? So yeah, George Russell got a run out in the full-on Merc, didn't he, in testing recently post-Bahrain. Look, way too early to start thinking about 2020. Yeah, I suspect that depends a lot on Bottas, doesn't it? Bottas has got a one-year contract to the end of this season. I think Mercedes will favour Esteban Ocon. I think George Russell's way too inexperienced yet to be put into that, unless he sets the world alight, and that's going to be very difficult to do in that Williams. So I think the most likely scenario is that unless Bottas sustains this new Bottas 2.0 that we saw in Australia and puts in a sustained championship challenge over the course of the entire season over and above Lewis Hamilton, in which case he will earn himself a contract extension, no doubt. I think their preference will be to have Ocon in that car alongside Lewis for next year. And what a lineup that will be. I think Ocon is a great driver. I think he deserves to be back on the grid. And if we see him in a Merc, wow, that's an exciting prospect. I think it'll be really interesting to see him up against the likes of Lewis Hamilton. Of course, going up against somebody like Lewis can make or break you as a driver. We were talking about psychology. What will that do if you've been the best all your career? That's why you've got to Formula One. If you come up against somebody, and it doesn't have to be Lewis, but in this situation, if you come up against Lewis, who beats you down in terms of mind games, beats you down in terms of his performance, his relentless performance, if that happens, what does that do to your psychology? That's when you might need a psychologist, sports psychologist, to help you out. But I would love to see Ocon in that Merc next year, if it's a great car going up against the likes of Lewis, to really see what he's made of. We've seen some really impressive stuff from Ocon, but we've yet to see it sustained constantly over an entire season. So I'd love to see him get that opportunity and just see what he can really do. Edward says, hi Mark, could Gasly's and Ricciardo's struggles hint towards the fact that the Red Bull behaves significantly differently from other cars, or is it more of a sign of how hard it is to adapt to a new team? Now I think this is a really interesting point, because I do think the Red Bull traditionally has been a kind of unique car. If you think back to the blown diffuser era, it was pretty specific the way that car worked. The amount of downforce, off-throttle downforce that thing was able to achieve was incredible, and that took a very specific way of driving. And then they went towards the high rate concept, which they accentuated over and above everybody else in terms of just the sheer rake on that car. And that generates downforce in a very different way, so will require a different driving style to get the best out of that car. So I think you may well have touched on a good point there, in that driving the Red Bull could require some different skills or a different approach to some of the other cars. And Ricciardo, having grown up with that, may well be struggling to adapt to the Renault because of the different downforce generating properties that car has. and likewise Gasly could be struggling to adapt to it. So I think that's a good point, Edward. I kind of agree with you. Bart Kuick says, would the cars look any different if Monaco wasn't on the calendar? Do specific circuits or even specific corners influence the design of a modern F1 car? Good point. I don't think they'd look any different if Monaco wasn't on the calendar. What you have to do when designing a car is look at the big picture of the entire calendar, and you try and find something that's a good balance for all of them. Of course, the Red Bull, for example, has been not necessarily tailored towards the higher downforce circuits, but they've had to move towards that way because of a power deficiency over the last few years. So they have perhaps put more focus on aerodynamics, and I guess the Adrian Newey effect focuses a lot of attention on aerodynamics as well. So they have naturally gone that way. But I don't think if you took Monaco off the calendar, things would look any different. Nobody designs a car with Monaco in their mind specifically. It's a bit of an outlier really in terms of the rest of the season, so the answer to that is no. Shogun Manuel George says, just thought of this, but why haven't F1 teams moved to carbon fibre wheels yet when Koenigsegg and more manufacturers recently have gone this route? Weight saving is obviously important in F1. It absolutely is, and if the rules allowed, they would 100% go carbon fibre wheels, but there is a specific line in the regulations that states they have to be made. I think it's one of two different magnesium alloys. So one of two different metallic materials that the FIA specify, that's what they have to make wheels from. So their hands are tied in that sense, in that the regs state they have to be metallic, otherwise 100% they'd go carbon. Adam Gornick says, on the recent rise of drivers who proved their worth in simulators, Giovinazzi, Kvyat, wonder why McLaren couldn't secure Van Dorn for that job. Merck snatched him up straight away. Are they real stars behind the curtain? It must be different to your time with open testing. It is different. The simulator drivers have a much bigger role to play these days because there's less on-track time. Why didn't McLaren sign up Van Dorn? I think the biggest question, or the biggest reason for that, is that Van Dorn, I suspect, if you'd offered him that role, wouldn't have taken it. I actually asked Stoffel recently, I saw him at a Formula E event, and I said to him, look, how do you feel about Formula One? Do you feel like it's chewed you up and spat you out with your short time? It's been a pretty brutal experience. How do you feel about it? He said, Formula One, fine. He said, I don't have any problem with Formula One. He said, I feel like McLaren chewed me up and spat me out. And I kind of can see that, I can see that there was a lot of focus towards Fernando in that team, and unfortunately Stoffel, who is a great driver, bore the brunt of that. He was kind of made to feel second best, I think. So I suspect if McLaren had offered him a simulator role, and they may well have done behind the scenes, I'm not sure he would have taken it. As for Mercedes, great opportunity. Getting the Mercedes simulator, potentially a route back into Formula One in the future, who knows, but he's doing Formula E and really, really enjoying it. When I did speak to him, he's loving Formula E. He's yet to fully get to grips with it, but he's absolutely really been reinvigorated in terms of loving motorsport again, and that's something that a lot of people say when they turn up in the Formula E paddock, I have to say. Chumley Warner says, a random, possibly dreary question for Ask Elvis with an electric Tuesday twist. Commercial garages have largely changed from air to electric tools, but F1 teams still use pneumatic wheel guns. Wondering why and if they've tried electric. Could it reduce the paraphernalia in the pit lane? The simple reason is that the sheer torque and power that you need to change the F1 pit stop wheel nuts at the speed you need to do it, you need to have something big and brutal like pneumatic. And if you did go to electric in order to achieve the same thing, you'd probably need a massive set of kit to go with it to be able to achieve those speeds and that level of power. So that's the simple reason. There's no real reason you couldn't do it with electric, but I think I don't see what advantage it brings you. The pit lane paraphernalia is not really an issue for anybody, and it works. Right, finally this one from Eric. With the Chinese GP coming up, the 1000th Grand Prix, unbelievable. I'll be there. Woohoo, well done Eric, enjoy it, have a great time mate, it's going to be an epic one. I'm curious how much humidity and air density, i.e. smog, affect aero setup and how it's balanced against track aero needs. Well, air density absolutely has an impact, and we know that, don't we? Because when we go to Mexico City at the high altitudes where the air is very thin and low density, it has a massive effect on aero. So we end up running almost maximum downforce in Mexico City at a track that otherwise, if it was at sea level, you would run at nowhere near that level of downforce, simply because the air is so dense you can't generate as much downforce through normal means. In terms of China, it's definitely not anywhere near as big an impact. In fact, so little an impact that I don't think it's factored in, as far as I remember. I think we just treat China as a normal event in terms of aero effects. In terms of the smog, I don't know actually what effect that has because it varies constantly year to year. You don't know until you turn up what smog levels are going to be like. And in that situation, you just run your car on a Friday, and if you find you need a bit more aero balance, you can make adjustments. But certainly we don't go to China with a specific aero package because of those things. Right, thank you very much again, guys. I'm sure it's been a slightly dull kind of location for this one. I'm just sat in a kind of computer room here at the hospital, the teaching hospital, because it's the only place I've got before I then head back to the airport to catch my flight home this evening. But thank you so much for all the questions. I hope some of those answers brought some clarity and some insight. Keep them coming as ever, because I'll try and keep answering them in the comments section here on YouTube and on Twitter or on Instagram, wherever you want to do it. Just use hashtag #AskElvis, and that way I'll definitely find them. But for now, folks, thank you so much. Enjoy the week, and I will hopefully catch you tomorrow with some action from the Goodwood 77th members meeting. Ta-da!